Hi, my name is Sanjay Chawla, Salient's Chief Product Officer. And in today's session, we're going to talk about, is VSaaS the right fit for your organization? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the different cloud-enabled deployment patterns that exist for video surveillance, talk about some of the pros and cons, some of the vendors who actually produce some of these solutions, and some of the important considerations if you decide that that might be an appropriate pattern for you. My goal is that at the end of this, you'll be well educated on what the different options are, what some of the important trade-offs are, and that you're well equipped to make the right decision for your organization or for a given deployment that you're working on. So let's dive in. And the first place to start is the hype that we have around cloud and VSaaS, because it's worth asking, why does all this matter? Why is everyone in such excitement to talk about VSaaS and talk about cloud? And I would contend that cloud is a very powerful and effective way to solve a couple of really important use cases, whether that is really simple, secure remote access, whether for live viewing or investigations, to simplify storage to do that offsite or in the cloud, whether that's evidence, whether that's just recording everything off into the cloud so that if the building burns down, it's okay. You've still got all your video surveillance, live monitoring and alerts, sharing, live or evidence, easy remote management, integrating with a variety of cloud or web-based solutions and technologies. Centralizing a deployment is something that cloud and kind of VSaaS solutions can do. So if you don't have a network between each of your independent sites, cloud can become a very powerful way to kind of tie together a bunch of disparate sites that you might have. And there's a ton more. And I would argue that there's been so much excitement, so much hype around cloud and VSaaS that they're such hot terms in the video surveillance and physical security industry, because it can be a powerful way to unlock a lot of use cases. And I'd actually contend that no one really cares about cloud or VSaaS. No one actually wants those things. What they actually want is simpler, easier, or cheaper solutions to their needs. And this is going to be important to remember, because as we talk about, is VSaaS right for you, it's important to perhaps tap in and think about, what use case are you really trying to solve? Because if you can hone in on what those problems are, and recognize that VSaaS or cloud is just one way to solve some of these problems, it can be a very effective and objective way to make an important decision about which way to go with a specific deployment pattern or product that you're evaluating. So let's dive in. And before we go too much further, I promise the only soapboxy thing I'll do here is, beware the hype. There's a ton of excitement about cloud and VSaaS and how effective they can be at solving some of these important use cases. But it's a trade-off, because choosing to use a VSaaS solution or a cloud-based solution to solve some of these use cases that we described, well, it might mean that you don't really have the right control or ownership, that you might be open to, a data breach exposing some of your stuff, a backdoor providing access to, your surveillance feeds, someone perhaps misusing or abusing, their privilege and their ability to remote access the system. And it doesn't really matter whether the issue is at a camera level, at a kind of VSaaS solution provider level, integrator kind of solution provider level. Almost at every single one of these levels, as the quote here has put it so nicely, when this data goes into the cloud, it can add some vulnerability, and so just something to be aware of. There is a trade-off, and it's not all roses and rainbows when thinking about VSaaS and what cloud can do in addressing some of these important use cases. But with that, again, cloud can be very powerful and effective. Let's talk about where it applies. And to do that, we're going to talk about a couple of predominant deployment patterns that exist in video surveillance. The easiest one to understand is our traditional deployment. Got everything: storage, recorders, cameras, clients, all of it on-prem. What can be challenging is to do stuff remotely. It's a poor experience, a challenging experience to get remote access into a just traditional totally on-prem deployment. Not impossible, not hard, but just it's a challenge area. And frankly, for a long time, this is how video surveillance worked. It was literally closed circuit. And only in more recent times has stuff become, a lot more open. But that's our first pattern we'll talk about. Next pattern we're going to talk about is the hybrid or bridge-based model. And I know these words, they get used a lot. They get used pretty differently. So I want to be somewhat specific. When I talk about these patterns, really, there's two of them I'm lumping together to make this webinar a little bit easier to consume. But one of these is taking that straight up traditional deployment and doing some work to get that connected up to the cloud, so that you can have really nice, remote access for live or recorded video. More importantly, you might do some amount of secondary, storage, whether it's clip or evidence sharing in the cloud, maybe some amount of secondary processing in the cloud. So perhaps an important feed or two at each location goes through some analytics that run, offsite in the cloud. So that's kind of the first flavor of hybrid. The more evolved version of that is, people recognizing that, gosh, I don't want the headache of perhaps managing a lot of this infrastructure. What if I went and got a proprietary bridge appliance where someone else can worry about the operating system, security patches, rolling out software updates? I don't want those headaches. And so certainly there are a variety of solutions that, fundamentally allow you to use pretty much any camera that you want, but take some of that infrastructure headache off. They do typically, though, involve proprietary storage in the cloud, proprietary processing in the cloud. So there is a little bit of give and take if you decide to go down the proprietary bridge appliance. But that's the hybrid model. And then, the most extreme version of this is camera to cloud, where usually, or in almost all cases except for one that we're going to talk about, it is a proprietary camera that's being used to then connect the kind of just up to cloud. And we'll talk a little bit about, the pros and cons of exactly where the video itself is stored. It can be on the camera, it can be up the cloud. But in camera to cloud, you've got, almost the exact opposite set of challenges as you do in the traditional model. And it's fascinating looking from left to right, where you go from remote access and doing things on the big wide internet being a challenge to you can only really have an experience if you have internet connectivity. And if you're totally offline, the system might not work super well. And so I'm not here in this webinar to kind of proclaim that one of these is the best deployment pattern and that there's a specific vendor or solution that's the right answer. That would be crazy. I'm here to help us understand some of the trade-offs, some of the pros and cons in these different things, because there really is a trade-off. The further to the left you go, the more flexibility, ownership, control that you have, the more you can do things completely offline. But you pay for that with some of the complexity. It takes some work to set these things up. There's infrastructure you have to manage and maintain, so that there's a little bit of a burden there. It can be difficult to do some of this stuff remotely. But as you go further and further to the right, what you get is the easy button. Man, just lick and stick cameras being, on the easiest side of easy, but it's turnkey. Things work remotely. But what you're giving up is, ownership. You might be locked into some of these solutions. You might not, even own the camera itself. Sometimes, effectively, it's a lease of even the camera equipment that you're, bolting onto your wall or ceiling. There's cost ramifications. Further to the right you go, chances are it's going to be a recurring subscription. And if you stop paying that, you got some issues. Further to the left, there's still, perpetual basis options available. So pay once, deploy it. It'll work as long as, you can still keep getting, maybe old Windows servers. And then, as we talked about, there can be some very serious cybersecurity ramifications the further to the right you go. Not that they can't exist to the left, it's just that it's not in your control anymore. It is, how good or bad the service provider is, how well they do maybe maintaining, backdoor access, or how good your integrator is, et cetera, et cetera. So just something to be aware of. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these patterns, we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons, We're talking about some real world solution providers. And then we're going to talk about just some important considerations for you to think about if you decide that that might be an important pattern for you to choose. So let's start with the traditional pattern. And again, it means everything's on-prem, storage, recorders, cameras, clients, on the same network, on the LAN. And you have the flexibility to kind of choose each of these components. And so some of the pros and cons kind of lay out like this. I would say the most important pro of a traditional deployment pattern, because this has been around, frankly, the longest, is the fact that it's these types of systems that allow you to achieve super high performance. They're super scalable, super high performance. And what I mean by that is if you get, one of these fancy new stitched multi-sensor panoramic cameras. You think you can get them from Axis, from Hanwha, from a variety of these manufacturers, and they're 30 megapixel, 50 megapixel. Well, say you wanted one of those cameras or a few of those, and you wanted to watch that thing full resolution, full frame rate. Gosh, you're not going to be doing that on most cloud-enabled solutions. They simply can't handle that type of bandwidth. But a traditional on-prem deployment, go nuts. You could absolutely set it up because you would typically control the network, the processing, all of it. You could set it up to achieve that. And so super high performance, super high kind of enterprise scalability. That's actually one of the hallmarks of these traditional, I'll say, deployment patterns. You're in full control. You can set this up so no data leaves your network. Also, another hallmark is the fact that it can be, typically anyway, it can be pretty straightforward integrating with a variety of other aspects of your security solution, whether that's access control, a variety of other sensors and devices. You have a radar system, you have some tripwire system, you have, FLIR thermal detectors, whatever it is. Great. Typically, when we're talking about these, kind of more established, old school, traditional, all on-prem, there is that flexibility to integrate with those aspects as well. But what are the drawbacks? Well, there's a lot of components to deploy, manage, and maintain. And typically, you're on the hook for doing that, whether it's the end user or the integrator. Someone's got to, feed, water, care for the cameras and the servers and the hard drives. It can also be challenging to enable secure remote access. Not impossible. And what's interesting is a lot of these solution providers have come up with remote access solutions to make that easy, just given how important and powerful it is to enable first responders or to share some evidence with the local PD. And then I'll say probably one of the most important drawbacks is because these solutions are often, not always, but often, all about high performance and advanced capabilities and stuff that really you can only benefit from doing kind of on-prem. Very, very typical to have, certification, courseware, training, kind of specialized skill set, advanced skill set to be able to fully leverage some of these products. They're not, the type of thing that you can hand to anyone and have them be successful at. It requires a bit of specialization, so it can take a little bit of work to fully leverage this. It's not always the case, but just it can be something where you need to be mindful of what you're investing in and kind of ask yourself the question of, can I actually get everything I want to that I'm paying for? Because it's a little bit more work with these traditional deployments. So a couple of examples, when we start talking about this, we've gone through all these pros and cons. To crystallize it a bit, we're talking about solutions like Genetec Omnicast, Avigilon Unity, Milestone ExpertTech. These are all deployed on-prem. Typically, you can pick the hardware it runs on. Sometimes there are some specific requirements. In other cases, a lot of these vendors have made it easier by providing, a hardware lineup. I would add Salient to this list. I was just trying not to be too biased, providing other examples. And look, the fit for these types of solutions is stuff that benefits, from some of this control and flexibility and ownership that we talked about as a hallmark of traditional deployments. So critical infrastructure, oil and gas is a great example. usually fairly specialized and nuanced deployment patterns and needs, a lot of strict bandwidth control because some of these sites can be very remote. So that's a pretty good example of a fit. Very security conscious customers, whether it's a nuclear research facility or a nuclear power plant, little to no interest in connecting this stuff up to the internet, highly regulated, which is kind of our next bullet point as well with things like healthcare, correctional facilities. But if you're super security conscious or highly regulated, well, that control and ownership and flexibility matters a lot to you. You're typically not cool with, all your video surveillance at some of these facilities living in someone's cloud or on someone's hard drive. You typically want to own that, and you want to carefully control who can access it and so on. Government often falls into this. And then, interestingly, I would say very large deployments. Like if there's a large single site, a large sports arena, a large college campus, or super specialized, and it often happens at sports arenas or college campuses where back to that stitched multi-sensor panoramic camera, you want to buy a few of those, and they cost a ton of money, and you want to actually get what you're paying for. Gosh, you're probably unlikely to do that with a lot of cloud-based or VSaaS-based solutions. Again, not saying that that's a bad thing. That's just an important consideration. And so a traditional prem-based deployment can be a great fit if you have a staff of people in a live security operations center really trying to leverage some of these capabilities, or if you have sites that are very large, because if you have a couple hundred cameras, you can run into some serious bandwidth constraints if you're doing a VSaaS or cloud-enabled deployment pattern. All right, some important things to consider if you've decided that the traditional pattern is the right one for you. Again, often it can be about some of the features that make sense on premise, whether it's specific integrations, whether it's getting some of that performance, whether it's some of that scalability. So really explore that and understand the cost and complexity to set up or use that, whether it's the infrastructure of whether it's networking or number of servers, whatever else it is to go set that up. But just that it's one of the benefits, but something that you really need to seriously consider because you're going to be on the hook for deploying, managing, maintaining all that. Integrations, again, it's a double-edged sword. It can be a very powerful benefit of a traditional on-prem deployment. You're not going to find a lot of VSaaS solutions that integrate with radar systems and also point of sale and also weight scales and also something else. But a lot of these traditional solutions absolutely will integrate with all of those things. But understand the quality of those integrations, how well they've been maintained, especially if it's specific access control solutions, just something to investigate. Also, the usage pattern and skill of both operators and administrators. Some of these solutions can be pretty easy to use, especially for operators. Sometimes there is a specific dedicated client just for operators to make that even easier. But realize that, especially in setting all this up to get all the capabilities out, you might need some slightly more sophisticated administrators. So just something to consider. And last but not least, I know we keep talking about it a lot, but for these traditional on-prem deployments, you have to consider how you're going to maintain and manage the solution. There is overhead there, it's real, and it's just something that you got to decide you want to sign up for because it's worth doing it to get that flexibility, control, ownership that you need. All right. The hybrid pattern. This one's going to be kind of interesting because we're lumping really two related but separate scenarios into one. The thing that is similar about the two pictures that we have here is the fact that in all cases with the hybrid solution, there is cloud connectivity. I think the difference is how much is really being kind of turnkey solved by a bridge-based appliance on-prem, which typically those things will do some amount of storage directly on premise. But in some cases, they don't record on-prem. In fact, they turn around, they stream up to the cloud. So just something to be aware of on how these appliances work. But in this pattern, we're really talking about remote access being a hallmark. and having some capabilities around, storing stuff in the cloud, processing stuff in the cloud. So let's kind of dive in. Um, what's cool about hybrid or bridge-based patterns, and there are so many of them. This is probably the largest category because a lot of vendors have decided there's some flavor of this that is important or relevant. And so typically you can get at least fairly high performance if you're on premise. So if you're on site and you're using a hybrid system and you're connected up locally to whatever the infrastructure is, whether it's your own infrastructure to run this, or if you're using a turnkey appliance to do this, typically it can be pretty high performance on premise. Often you can leverage a lot of your existing infrastructure. So typically these solutions will work with any camera. In many cases, there's good flexibility around integrating with access control and kind of just other aspects of your infrastructure. So that's typically the case. But because these are cloud enabled, it can be a lot simpler to do remote access, whether that's first responders or evidence sharing. Forensically, you want to hand some evidence to the local PD. That becomes a lot easier because it's usually just part of the offering. And there is a potential to simplify or even eliminate some of the management and maintenance burden. What I find interesting about the hybrid or bridge-based pattern is, it's kind of an in-between doing everything by yourself and leaving everything on a proprietary, VSaaS camera provider that's going to do camera to cloud. This is that good in-between step. Now, some things to watch out for. You might have limited flexibility and control, depending on how much you lean into the turnkey bridge-based appliance. That can limit you. Also, in some cases, not always, you might be forced to connect your system to the internet. That's how some of these solutions work. And so just that might be a drawback for some people. Some people might not care. But again, just realize that that's a factor. Some of these solutions, especially as you get closer to that, bridge-based appliance, it's a bit more turnkey. The only model to kind of purchase and deploy that is to do a subscription, and if you don't pay your subscription, you might not have a functioning VSaaS, or you might not have a functioning video surveillance system. Period. So just something to be aware of. It's in these types of solutions that you start crossing over from a predominantly perpetual licensing model to subscription. So something to be aware of. Also, again, depending on kind of which flavor you go with, you may or may not have control over where and how your video recordings are stored. And so if that's really important to you, you have these grand visions one day of maybe integrating, all your video in with other stuff. And it's important for you to have that, on-prem in your data center or on your own hard drive so you can do whatever you want to with it. Well, then you want to be careful about the type of hybrid or bridge solution that you go for. And last but not least, very related, is you might not have control over who can access your system. Again, if you go to bridge-based appliance and it requires cloud connectivity and it's a subscription you have to pay, there might be some, backdoors. There might be, just some things where you're not in full control over who can administrate that box. And again, maybe you see that as a benefit, but just realize that if it's important for you to control who can see your video feeds, who can access that data, who can do all those things, you're kind of at the mercy of some of these solution providers. So who has these types of solutions? Because there are so many solutions that fit into this category. You've got names like OpenEye and EagleEye that have hybrid or bridge-based solutions. You've got both Avigilon Alta, previously formerly known as Ava, that has a solution like this. You've also got Avigilon Unity Cloud Services. It's a really powerful way to bring some of these cloud-enabled capabilities to a traditional on-prem deployment. Same with Salient Cloud Services. I'll brag on us for a minute. We have a traditional VMS, but we have a set of cloud services that allow you to tap into some of these really cool things. And you've got so many other vendors, Solink, Spot AI. Gosh, I could go on for days. The number of solutions that have some type of a hybrid approach, where there are pieces that exist on premise besides the camera, and then some pieces that can be done kind of off in the cloud. And I think there's quite a bit of a market to this. And again, I know we talked about fit for the traditional deployment, and it's a bit fuzzy because some of this is also going to come down to the temperament of the customer. Again, some end users really care a lot about control and ownership. And so these may or may not be the right solutions for them. But typically, you'll see a lot of multi-site retail, maybe a regional convenience store be a really good fit for a pattern like this. A lot of education, both K through 12 and higher ed. Large multi-site, commercial real estate, whether it's malls, corporate offices, are often a good fit for this. It's kind of the best of both worlds, and you get to experience that quite a bit on some of these multi-site deployments, especially ones that are larger. And so let's talk about some of the considerations. Given the number of different types of solutions that fit into the hybrid or bridge-based pattern, you're going to really want to get clear on stuff like, is cloud optional or mandatory? So for example, with Salient Cloud Services, or even with the Vigilon Unity cloud service, it's optional. It's not mandatory. You don't have to do cloud, and that can be an important consideration. Whereas, with something like Eagle Eye, there is no option. It's cloud is mandatory. You're going to want to know where video recordings are stored. That might be kind of important to understand how much flexibility and control you have there, where that actually lives. You're also going to want to understand if there's, a recurring subscription that's mandatory. Maybe there's certain capability that requires, subscription, but maybe there are other parts of it that don't. So getting very clear on that. If it's important to you to, leverage existing infrastructure, can you bring your own hardware, whether that's servers and other stuff, storage? Can you bring any camera to the table? Integrations, again, similar to, this is going to be a recurring theme, just how tightly integrated a surveillance and physical security system. Some people, it's very important for it to be tightly integrated together. For some people, it's less important. But this can be a very important consideration, because some of these hybrid or bridge solution providers, often sometimes they do integrate really well with other solutions, and sometimes they don't. So that can be a deciding factor. Also want to consider, what are the limitations? How large can a site be? Some of these, especially if it's a traditional solution that has some cloud capabilities, maybe there's no limits to how much you can scale this. But some of the newer solutions that use proprietary kind of appliances, whatnot, maybe there are some limits, especially if it's how many cameras can you remotely access from a site. And there's some limits on just bandwidth. So something to think about there. And then I think one that gets overlooked quite a bit, especially as you start getting into hybrid or bridge-based patterns, is there a way to control who has access to the system? Because fundamentally, you're connecting these systems to cloud services that you don't run. Someone else is hosting and running these cloud services, and they might be doing something as simple as remote management or remote access. They might be doing something a lot more sophisticated, like helping you store all your video up in the cloud. And understanding who has access to this, because these services are touching cameras and surveillance that you have deployed on-prem, and it might matter a lot to you. And so just really thinking through what kind of control you have, understanding how that's managed, the processes around it. I think it often gets very overlooked in the hype around, hey, look at what cloud can do for you, but something important to consider. All right. Our last pattern, camera to cloud. And I know it's gotten a bad rap from the likes of Verkada. Some people love it, some people hate it. But let's talk about camera to cloud. So some of the pros of a camera to cloud solution are, it's just super easy. I mean, you've got lick and stick cameras where it is literally lick and stick and you're done. And also, a lot of these solutions do make it very easy for a lot of operators to do that live search and export and share, live or recorded video. And what's great is there's not a ton to configure or manage. It's back to that super easy. It's camera to cloud, and so maybe there's very little maintenance, in some cases almost no maintenance. Now, some of the challenges, some of the drawbacks are if you go camera to cloud, sometimes, or in the overwhelming majority of cases, you usually can't use your existing investments, especially your existing cameras. Now, there are some notable things going on here. Genetec Stratocast, to highlight them, they've got a camera to cloud solution where you can use any camera. And I think what's even cooler than that is the fact that there is an exciting new ONBIF standard that's underway to help codify camera to cloud. So my hope is we only see more camera agnostic camera to cloud solutions. Today, a lot of the really big popular ones you could kind of require you to go down the route of a proprietary camera, but that might not be a strong limitation for a very long time as this pattern continues to evolve. Typically, though, these solutions just don't work without a subscription, and typically they're practically unusable without the internet. Also, integrations can be very complicated. Again, a lot of these solutions are just vertically integrated top to bottom, and so there's not a lot of room for bringing your own access control solution and deciding you want to integrate with some, radar or thermal detector or weight scale or point of sale or whatever else it is. It's kind of what the platform provides, and if that doesn't work, tough luck. So something important to consider. And then also, if for any reason you said change your mind, many of the pieces of a video surveillance system for a long time were interchangeable. You could, replace your VMS, you could replace your camera, you could decide you want to use different hard drives or different servers. Typically, these things were interchangeable, but as you get to these bridge-based appliances, and certainly by the time you get to a camera to cloud, it may not be possible to reuse the proprietary cameras. And it's gotten a bad rap around hostage as a service. It's a real thing to consider, though. You pay all this money, you put all these cameras up, you decide you maybe want to use a different solution or use these differently. You might not be able to. So something to keep in mind. And last but not least, again, you have remote access. It's super easy, but recognize that it might be restricted in terms of how much, bandwidth you can pull through. So there might be some bitrate limitations. Sometimes those things are baked into these platforms. They only allow certain amount of resolution and frame rate to be accessed remotely anyway. Sometimes there can be some latency. In many cases, multiple seconds of latency. So just something to watch out for when you're doing camera to cloud. And I guess we didn't put it on this list. There's a maintenance burden to also worry about. I talk about this in considerations, but some camera to cloud solutions, or many of them, actually do the recording directly on the camera. That's all good and great. It's just everything fails, and there's going to come a point in time when the onboard camera storage has failed and needs to be replaced. That can be a bad day. Maybe it's an opportunity to go just replace all the cameras. If that camera's lasted for 5-10 years or something. But in some cases, maybe nothing's wrong with the camera. You don't want to replace the full-blown camera. It can be quite a bit of work to put a ladder up, whether it's just replace the camera, but more importantly, to take down the camera and replace the storage that's on board the camera. Just there's a bad maintenance day waiting for you somewhere if it's the camera that's doing all the recording. So something to be aware of. So let's talk about a couple of examples, some vendors that provide this type of solution. Obviously Verkada, I think, has made a big name. Meraki and Rhombus are similar, but Vigilant Ava, what people don't realize is Vigilant Ava cameras actually can do this. Variety of others. Actually, this is not a comprehensive list. These are just examples. Genetec Stratocast provides a solution that enables camera to cloud and allows you to bring a variety of different cameras to bear. I think a really good fit for camera to cloud, given some of the limitations, especially around flexibility, ownership, control. I really do think it's best suited for, small mom and pop type of retail like Nina's Nail Salon, quick serve restaurants, multifamily residential. Um, I worry sometimes about this particular pattern being used in large, multi-site deployments, enterprise deployments, because I worry that some of the limitations maybe are inappropriate for this pattern in those environments. But there's a lot of hype, and it's driving some of that. So it'll be interesting to see how those deployments unfold. But just given some of the trade-offs on bandwidth and how some of these solutions are put together, just something to recognize. And so that gets us to what to consider. If you've decided that maybe this is the right pattern for you, you're going to want to pay attention to where the video is stored. Again, there's that maintenance issue that you're going to have to deal with at some point if the video is stored primarily on the camera. If it's not stored primarily on the camera, you just have to worry about the fact that if there's any interruptions in network connectivity, you might have gaps or outages. And some of these are very sophisticated where they might even record to both places, but the camera and also to the cloud. But again, there's bandwidth realities to this. So something to be aware of is, where is the video stored? How does it get there? And how do you manage that over time? Because you don't have the headache of a lot of that setup that you would otherwise have. But when it does hit, it can be a pretty heavy maintenance burden to suddenly deal with. How locked in will you be is kind of the next question. Is there a way to leverage the cameras with another solution if you ever need to change your mind, or are you stuck with this? And also recognize that if fees or subscription rates change, you're kind of at the mercy of just having to pay up. Otherwise, you don't have a working system. So understanding how locked in you are can be useful, and also understanding how much leverage you have if one day you're not happy with a price increase that you don't want to deal with. Also, you're going to want to think about how many cameras you have at some of your larger sites, because if part of the appeal is being able to do all this, remotely, and you just have the cameras deployed and no other infrastructure, and it's great, you can access the video from anywhere. Just realize that if that remote access part is important, along with the no infrastructure part, there are just some physical limits. And are you going to have the uplink bandwidth to have the experience that you want to have? And again, probably a thing that gets overlooked. It's pretty obvious on the camera to cloud that you're probably a little bit past the issue on worrying about who can access these systems, because after all, you're signing up for having cameras that are deployed on your location, connected up to the big wide internet, and remotely managed, going through software updates, all that kind of stuff. All the goodness that comes with it typically means you've got another entity, a corporation, a service provider, whomever, maybe integrator, who often can do quite a bit to that camera. So just realize you probably already crossed that bridge, so to speak. But maybe one thing to consider, if you haven't, is, are you okay having so many IoT devices, that's what these cameras are, connected directly to the internet? It might sound great, and it might be true that the solution provider is working very hard to make sure that these are secure and patched and maintained, but it's very asymmetric. The more these solutions get popular, it's just there's so many more attackers that are able to collaborate. And often the defense is isolated. It's not like a lot of these manufacturers collaborate on having great, robust cybersecurity in a joint fashion. That's always been one of the issues with cybersecurity, is the asymmetric nature of attackers and defenders. The attackers, the bad guys, often get to collaborate. The good guys often don't get to collaborate. And so just it's happened time and again, kind of devices being connected to the internet being an exposure point. And so just something to consider. It may or may not be appropriate. You might have the risk appetite for it, you might not, but it's something strongly worth considering. So in a nutshell, we've gone through kind of the pros and cons, what these different patterns are, when they're appropriate, when they're less appropriate, some of the important questions to ask. And so hopefully you're leaving this better informed about some of the vendors that provide these types of things, the pros and cons, some of the considerations. And so if there's some takeaways as you leave this webinar, thanks for tuning in and making it this far. Get off the hype train. It's very exciting, and everyone wants to talk about adopting cloud or VSaaS, but get off the hype train. It's the least helpful thing. really think about the requirements that you have, because it's great. We live in a world where we have all of these options, and it's perfectly okay that there's no one size fits all. The nail salon is very different from the airport, and that's very different from the jail and the school and everything else. And so it's awesome that we have this type of flexibility in choosing the right solution. And so get off the hype train and really strongly think about what problems you're trying to solve, what use cases are most important to you. And from those requirements, think about how some of these different deployment patterns fit or don't fit what you're trying to accomplish. Recognize that fundamentally there is deep in the middle of this a trade-off between how easy something is and the amount of control and flexibility that you have. And think about what's most appropriate for you on that spectrum of ease of use versus having that desire to control and own, and have the right flexibility to meet your specific needs. And last but not least, I've seen this happen a lot. It's painful to watch, but if I have a takeaway, given the number of solution providers, given the number of technologies, given all these deployment patterns, sometimes there's no amount of academic thinking about it that solves it. Sometimes it's getting your hands on these things with all the right stakeholders. And I would argue that there's no shortcut, especially for larger deployments, to have hands-on user testing. And even beyond that, to go small, start at a single site, start at a single location, really prove it out. Make sure those integrations work if that's what's important. Make sure the people can actually use it if it's a more sophisticated solution. And don't feel like you got to jump all in, and don't feel like you got to remain committed to a solution. What's great is the number of different competitive solutions out there that provide this full spectrum. So to wrap up, is VSaaS right for your organization? Maybe. And hopefully in this presentation, we've had a chance to see just the number of different ways that cloud and internet connected services can help with a variety of different aspects. And so thank you all for tuning in, and excited that we're going to have so many more people informed about making the right choices.